All right, so starting our section on affect and emotions. But before we go ahead and get started, some quick updates. Activity 4 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. and quiz 3 is now graded. Your third activity will be graded as soon as possible, hopefully by the end of this week. And make sure to watch the supplementary videos posted on the YouTube channel on one of the playlists, but also it is posted on Canvas for this week's module. So, why study emotions, especially in sociology? It seems like something that maybe um, doesn't necessarily, it's not something that you would expect of sociology, considering that we're not really concerned with individual cognition. However, we are concerned with emotion in terms of how it facilitates and constrains, and just overall how it shapes group behavior and human interaction, very much from a social perspective. So, despite emotions being this, fundamentally psychological phenomena, something that's really not of interest in sociology, it is very much an interest in sociological social psychology, however. And there are a few reasons for this that we're going to discuss um, in this today's lecture. And so today we're really going to cover a lot of the definitions and kind of fundamentals of emotions, just to get us all on the same page about when we're discussing emotions from a sociological social psychology perspective, what exactly are we talking about, and you know how are we approaching this. And again, like I've stated many times before, a lot of the terminology can be a little bit confusing. It's not because these words are necessarily new to us, but they're used in a very specific way. They're not used kind of flippantly, like, oh, emotions or feelings, because those are different things. They're defined differently. So just to kind of get us on the same page about what each of these words mean and how we're going to move forward, how they're applied in social psychology. Um, and so hopefully this week we'll get to cover, and next week, of course, we'll get to kind of cover some of the more fun aspects of this particular section, because it's not um, a super deep area of research, but there's quite a bit, and there's a lot of variation in the ways in which the sociological social psychologists have used emotions and looked at emotions, and understanding how emotions, like I said, facilitate and constrain group behavior and interaction um, in small groups or on a one-on-one basis. So if you're just watching this online, make sure that you go to the slides or just search the name of this video on YouTube. It's the Asch conformity experiment, um, which will be really helpful in kind of understanding this example. But again, going back to why study emotions. So there are three main reasons why sociological social psychologists study emotion. Um, the first is that um, there are implicit or explicit mechanisms that help explain other social psychological phenomena. And so, again, we're not directly studying emotions per se, but more so their role in human interaction and group behavior. And so, um, some of the things that I wanted to highlight in terms of this specific point and this reason for studying emotions is one that the social interactional dynamics that were identified by Goffman, which we discussed, so kind of like impression management. They're motivated by trying to avoid embarrassing yourself or others. So when we think of impression management, it's not just about, we talked about it in terms of symbolic interactionism and how that's one way that society remains stable over time. We talked about it in terms of identity and how, we're trying to have a certain identity verified, or we're trying to put forward this certain impression, or, we're acting from the point of view of a specific identity, whichever one is salient in that moment. But when we think about it in terms of emotion, the motivations for impression management, kind of that core motivational factor is to avoid some kind of embarrassment or discomfort, or maybe you're seeking out positive reinforcement, or whatever the case may be. And again, that's to meet social expectations, which in itself is related to those same like positive and negative feelings you get when maybe an identity is verified or you've successfully created the impression that you intended to. Another key point here is uh, conformity. And so that's where the Ash conformity experiment comes into play. And so conformity in this sense, the people in the experiment, they are, they ask them to do something like comparing two lines, which one is longer. And all of the people in the experiment, most of the people are in on it. And they all pick the one that's obviously shorter. And all these other people who weren't aware that this was an experiment, or at least, what it was, um, knew that that was obviously wrong. And you can see them looking around very confused, but they go ahead and choose that anyway, so they conform to the um what everyone around them is doing and saying is correct, even though they know that it isn't actually correct. And so that's in a response to perhaps the fear associated with nonconformity and that discomfort. And that would fall into the realm of emotion in this case. And then a lot of actions are based, all actions they would argue are based on emotions. So seeking positive emotions and avoiding negative emotions. The second reason why we might study emotion are that they're an integral part of social bonding. Individuals' bonds with others, or lack thereof, are created and reinforced by emotional experiences elicited through these bonds. And these social bonds tend to give rise to social institutions, um, which we'll discuss a little bit. But individual phenomena contributes to that institutional phenomena. Again, connecting the individual to the greater society, and how we continually create and recreate situations on the individual level that shapes things on the institutional level, and then more on like a societal level. So that's an example of us, society being created from the bottom up. Whereas oftentimes we talk about society being created from the top down, especially when we talk about things like socialization, for example. But again, going back to that first key point is um, that how, emotion, these bonds are very critical in terms of human interaction and how we come together. Something that we'll touch on at another point. And is that it creates kind of this collective effervescence, being one example, which we'll touch on later on. But it's, if you have positive emotions when you're interacting with someone, you're more likely to continue that interaction, um, which again is something that we're going to discuss later on our section on social exchange, and delve more deeply into that. But our bonds are created, or, a lack of that. Um, they're created and reinforced through these emotional experiences, um, and so on. And so, one example I wanted to point out for social bonds giving rise to social institutions. These bonds, you know, they often give rise to these more emergent institutions such as marriage and religion. And, as a result, emotions provide this important piece of the puzzle concerning the question of how individual phenomena contribute to that institutional phenomena. So again, linking the individual to the institution, and then to the greater society. And the third reason why we might want to study emotions are that emotions can help explain macro social phenomena. And so again, working our way up from society being built from the bottom up instead of the top down. Although we see that as this reciprocal relationship of society shaping us while we are shaping society. Um, and so some of the key points here are that emotions in this sense can explain the rise and dynamics of social movements. which is evident in the video here. I thought it would be a really good example for this point. It can also be used to explain things like war and national conflicts. And emotions are also an important part of the cognitive categorizations that justify, motivate, and perpetuate social stratification. And these are things that we're going to touch on more. But to kind of give you a taste of what are some of the conversations that are going on in this area of research, and what are some of the reasons why sociologists and sociological social psychologists um, want to understand emotion and want to understand how emotions um, can be a catalyst for something like a social movement or something like war. And so there are lots of reasons why we would want to study emotions. But again, not necessarily the emotions themselves. We're not really looking at the emotions themselves, but more so how they function um, in context, and that context being fundamentally social. So, some definitions. And again, these are really important because, excuse me, there's so many different terms that are used, and they're not used flippantly, they're used with intent. And so the social psychological literature on emotions uses a variety of terms such as emotions, sentiments, feelings, affects, and moods. And these are often conflated with one another. This conflation is an unfortunate empirical reality, especially given that there are conceptual definitions of each of the terms that allow for analytic and empirical differentiation, which is something that's important. And so these words have very specific meanings. So when you can define something, you can better measure it, you can better discuss it. Um, but what's kind of difficult and why they're so often conflated is because they're such a common part of our everyday discussions on things like emotions. So feelings are the subjective experiences of specific psychological and or physical states. And so they're a very general term that encompasses emotions, but also includes physical states such as hunger and pain. And they're also often used to refer to subjective experiences of emotions by individuals. And so here, emotions are those short term psychological and physiological states that usually consist of the following five elements, which are right here. So, again, emotions are short term, psychological, and physiological states that usually consist of these following five elements. And so, this is what, when we think of emotions in this specific context, this is what they're referring to. So, appraisals of situations. So, think of like the definition of the situation and the psychological changes that occur as a result of the definition of the situation, of appraising a situation as good or bad or dangerous or positive, and so on. And then gestures that express these emotions to others. So you use gestures and facial expressions and eye contact and all of these different things to convey how you're feeling about a situation or a particular issue or topic or interaction. And then linguistic labels that name the combination of psychological physiological changes and expressive gestures. So we have these labels, like let's say I don't know, nervousness. When you think of nervousness, you're not necessarily just thinking about what it feels like to be nervous. You think about, maybe someone's kind of, um, jittery or antsy, or they're kind of moving around, they're fidgeting a lot more. Maybe they're blushing, or, whatever the case may be. You're thinking of all these different physiological changes, all these different physical movements and gestures, and we have particular labels. That we use to describe not just feelings, but also the actions and facial expressions that go along with that. And so I think, I think of a game like charades. How does somebody convey nervousness or fear or shame? Because there's these gestures that are associated with them. And then finally, what we call refractory state. So during this state, um, individuals cognitively focus on how to resolve or continue the emotional state. So, for example, individuals experience anger when they are prevented from achieving a desired goal. So, that being like a situational cue here. This situational cue causes physiological changes such as rapid heartbeat and muscle tension, and gestures such as, downward eyebrows and tensed lips in the face, and derogatory verbalizations. And the combination of these things and these factors has its own, they have their own um, uh, linguistic term. So, again, like anger amongst English speaking people, for example. So, like anger being like this particular um, linguistic label that we've applied to these changes. And as we discussed previously, emotions are these short term experiences that typically last anywhere from a few seconds to a few hours. Um, Moods, on the other hand, moods are slight but continuous emotional states that can last hours, days, and even months. Moods prime and motivate individuals to feel specific emotions. So, for example, if individuals are in a happy mood, they're ready to become happy and look for situational cues that will create happy emotions. And so, unlike emotions, moods do not seem to be elicited by specific situational cues. That is, individuals are often unaware of why they are in an irritable mood, but are usually aware of why they are angry. And then we have sentiments, which here, sentiments are a term used to refer to what several social psychologists call social emotions, or emotions that individuals learn during socialization processes. And these are elicited through and organized around social relationships and social interactions. So, for example, envy is considered a sentiment because it is elicited through social interaction and organized around social relationships, such as when an individual experiences jealousy after learning that another person acquired something that the individual wanted. Other sentiments include emotions such as embarrassment, shame, guilt, pride, reverence, and so on. And sentiments are also sometimes called secondary emotions. But then we have affect. And affect, like feelings, can simply refer to the subjective aspects of emotional experience. And so there are three dimensions to affect when we're discussing affect. It's the evaluation of an object as either good or bad, potency, so powerful and powerless. So how powerful something is, or how much does it lack power. So kind of like that intensity, um, and then activity. So fast or slow. So these are kind of the three dimensions that when we're thinking of affect. Um, so again, that subjective aspect of emotional experience. We're thinking of how good or bad something is, how powerful, and forceful this particular emotional experience is, and the activity. Is it fast? Is it slow? So kind of giving it all of these different dimensions and characteristics and way to make it, I guess, like more three-dimensional being the term, giving it more um, body and dimension essentially. And then we have typologies of emotion. So first we have primary emotions, and these emotions are based on fundamental neurobiological processes that are common to all humans. And these are also called basic or fundamental emotions. And so some of the qualities of primary emotions are that they're evolutionary adaptive, they emerge early in life. Um, there are differing autonomic patterns, and they're cross culturally universal. So, some examples of primary emotions could be like happiness, anger, fear, sadness, surprise, disgust, curiosity. Um, and so on. And then we have secondary emotions. And secondary emotions emphasize emotional experiences that are explicitly experienced and elicited by social relationships and interactions. So they're derived from primary emotions and are considered, uh, so they would include something like love, jealousy, envy, empathy, sympathy, grief, shame, and guilt. And so sometimes these overlap, and sometimes they're very distinct in terms of these primary and secondary emotions. But secondary emotions, again, so these are kind of the three different ways that sociological social psychologists talk about secondary emotions. And so again, the first one is that they're derived from primary emotions, or they're socialized derivatives of primary emotions, or they're mixtures to varying degrees of primary emotions. So, for example, one researcher argues that shame, which he defines as the sense that one has acted in an unworthy manner, is a socialized derivative of anger. So, during socialization, the child learns that others, particularly their parents, react to undesirable behaviors with anger. And through the process of internalization and taking the role of the other, the child eventually learns to direct this anger towards him or herself when committing, you know, particularly, I don't know, bad or, shameful actions in their eyes. And so most social psychological thought on secondary emotions, however, argues that again they can be mixtures to varying degrees of primary emotions. So one example for this is that one researcher argues that many secondary emotions, such as anxiety, wonder, nostalgia, and grief are mixtures of primary emotions of fear, anger, depression, and happiness. So, as you can see, there's quite a few different ways in which we can discuss emotions and define these particular terms. But when you are reading your assigned reading for next week, or we're having our discussions in class Wednesday, or both days next week, these terms have very specific meaning and we're discussing them in a very specific way. But hopefully, this was a good introduction to how we'll be discussing emotions and how they are relevant to sociological social psychology and the ways in which you can apply some of these things to your um, future career and to your everyday life. But other than that, that's it. Activity 4 is due Friday. Thanks.